The rice mill dumped husks near a boy's farm for years. He used them to revive his soil. Wyatt Cole was 24 the night he found his father's letter, unfinished, folded inside a feed sack that wasn't supposed to be there. He didn't read it. Not yet. He just sat down in the dark barn and held it. That was the night everything started, though it would take 2 more years for him to understand why. Hartwell Bend, Arkansas, sat at the end of a 2-lane road, surrounded by 210 acres of rice ground that had belonged to the Cole family since 1957. Every morning, Wyatt still parked the old Ford in the exact spot his father used to park it, nose toward the east field, even though there was no reason left to do that. Old habits stood in for the man who wasn't there to keep them. Daniel Cole had died 2 years earlier, alone in a grain bin, suffocated under rice that shifted the way rice does when nobody expects it. Wyatt had been 300 miles away at the time, sitting in an agricultural engineering lecture. The last real conversation he'd had with his father was an argument. Daniel had asked him to come home for the weekend to help with the bins. Wyatt had said he was busy. He never got to take it back. His younger sister, Callie, 19, worked lunch shifts at Ruth's Diner in town and split what she could toward the farm's banknote. Their mother had died of illness when Wyatt was 10, so it had always just been the 3 of them, then 2. By that second spring, the Cole farm was in trouble. Yields had been sliding for 6 straight years, long before Daniel died, 38 bushels an acre on ground that used to give 60. Nobody could say exactly why. The soil just seemed tired, the way a person gets tired, worn down by the same work repeated too many years in a row. 2 neighboring families had already sold out to a development company from Little Rock. A third was renting their acres to a company that farmed with machines and nobody's last name on the mailbox. Wyatt had gone to school with most of those neighbors' kids. 2 of them were already gone, one to Memphis, one to Texas, chasing jobs that didn't smell like diesel and standing water. At the 4th of July picnic that summer, one of them, a boy named Cody who'd sold his family's plot the year before, told Wyatt flat out, "You're the only one dumb enough left to still be doing this." He didn't mean it cruelly. It just sounded, to Wyatt, like the truth everyone else had already accepted. Wyatt's uncle, Dale Cole, farmed the 40 acres next door and had opinions about all of it. "Your daddy poured his whole life into ground that quit giving back," Dale told him one evening, leaning on the fence. "Man's got no shame telling you, sell it before it finishes you too." "It's not for sale, Uncle Dale," Wyatt said. Dale spat into the dirt and shook his head. "Pride's a luxury the bank doesn't accept as payment, boy." He nodded toward the gray mound of husks in the low corner. "And whatever you think you're going to do with that mill trash, I'd think twice. Some things are dumped where they're dumped for a reason." Wyatt didn't have an answer for that yet. He just watched his uncle's truck pull away and went back to work. The only buyer interested in the coal crop was Big River Milling, the largest mill in the county, run by a man named Vernon Voss. Voss's office smelled like grain dust and cigar smoke, and a black-and-white photo of his father, Otto, hung behind the desk, watching over every deal Vernon made. Voss offered feed-grade prices, just enough to cover the loan interest, nothing more. "It's not a great year for rice, Wyatt," Voss said, sliding a contract across his desk. "But I'm being generous, considering." "Considering what?" Wyatt asked. Voss shrugged, not quite meeting his eyes. "Considering that ground of yours has never done your family any favors." He tapped the contract with 2 fingers. "Sign it. Take the sure thing." Wyatt signed it. He didn't have another option yet. But he noticed on his way out that Voss watched him a little too long through the office window. For as long as anyone could remember, Big River's husk trucks had dumped their waste, the papery hulls left over from milling, into the low, marshy corner of the coal land nobody farmed. It had always just been there, an old arrangement nobody questioned, a gray mountain of husks that Dale called the ugliest view in the county. 2 weeks after his father's funeral, Wyatt started walking out to that husk pile at night. He didn't tell anyone why. He'd shovel a wheelbarrow's worth onto a patch of the worst, most exhausted soil on the farm, then walk back to the house before sunrise. Callie noticed first. "You're hauling trash onto dead dirt in the dark," she said. "Are you okay?" "I don't know yet," Wyatt admitted. "I just have a feeling." He didn't tell her about the second thing he'd found in his father's things, a small brass key, rusted at the teeth, that didn't fit the house, the truck, or a single lock on the property. 3 weeks in, Wyatt tried burning a pile of husks in an open metal drum behind the barn, hoping to turn them into something the soil could use. It went badly. The fire caught wind, roared hot and fast, and left him with nothing but a drum of pale gray ash. When he dug the ash into his test patch, the rice seedlings there yellowed and died within a week. That same week, Big River's trucks stopped coming. No warning. When Wyatt drove out to ask why, Voss's answer was short. "Heard you've got big plans for that husk pile," Voss said, not quite smiling. Funny how word travels in a small town. Nobody in Wyatt's circle would admit to mentioning it to anyone. He had told exactly 3 people what he was doing: Callie, Uncle Dale, and Ray Dawkins, his best friend since grade school, who'd been picking up part-time work on the farm since Daniel died. All 3 swore it wasn't them. Wyatt let it go, but the question sat in the back of his mind like a splinter. It was Otis Grady, 71, a retired county extension agronomist who'd known Wyatt's grandfather, who finally explained what had gone wrong. Otis showed up unannounced one Saturday, having heard from Callie that Wyatt was burning trash in the yard like a crazy person. "You made ash, son, not char," Otis said, turning a fistful of the failed batch over in his palm, letting it crumble through his fingers like flour. "Burn husks with plenty of air and you get nothing but alkaline dust, hard on young roots, and too much of it will scorch a seedling worse than no treatment at all. Burn them slow, starved of oxygen, and the carbon stays locked in a honeycomb structure instead of turning to smoke. Under a microscope, that structure looks like a sponge full of tiny rooms. Those rooms are what hold water during a dry spell. They're what hold nutrients so rain doesn't wash them straight past the roots. They're where the good bacteria and fungi set up house. It's the difference between feeding your ground and choking it." "So how do you keep the air out?" Wyatt asked. "Cover the fire before it gets greedy," Otis said. "Dig a pit, load your husks, light it, then smother it down to a slow smolder with a sheet of tin and a few inches of dirt. Starve it just enough to char, not enough to snuff it out entirely. Takes patience. Most men don't have it." Otis also had something else to show him. He recognized the rusted key. "That opens your granddad's toolbox, out in the old equipment shed. Elias tried something just like this, back around 68. Never got far with it." Inside the strongbox, Wyatt found a water-warped notebook in his grandfather's handwriting, describing an early attempt to improve that same low corner of the farm with charred husks, and a short, bitter note about trouble with the mill that ended the experiment for good. "Your granddad had a deal lined up once too," Otis said quietly. "A trading contact overseas. Fell apart. Otto Voss saw to that, Vernon's father. Old history. I figured it died with both of them." Wyatt said nothing. But he didn't forget it. With Otis's help, Wyatt built a simple covered pit kiln, starved of air, and produced his first real batch of biochar. He worked it into a quarter-acre test plot along with the worst of the old husk pile, now finally put to use. He waited. By harvest, that quarter-acre was pulling 61 bushels an acre, up from 38 the year before. Milling recovery, the percentage of whole, unbroken kernels, jumped from 52% to 68%. It wasn't the whole farm. It wasn't even close to fixing everything. But it was real, and it was his. Uncle Dale walked the test rows himself, said nothing for a long moment, then aloud, "Well, it's not garbage dirt anymore. I'll give you that much." It wasn't an apology. But it wasn't mockery either, and Wyatt noticed the difference. The improved rice was different, too. Plumper kernels, cleaner milling, a story behind it that specialty buyers liked. Wyatt started selling small stone-milled bags out of a folding table at the end of the driveway, 25 bags a week at first, then 50. A regional distributor noticed and put in a standing order. Then, through an old contact listed in his grandfather's notebook, Wyatt reached a Rotterdam buyer named Joost Bakker, grandson of the very trader Elias had once tried to deal with decades before. The first phone call ran almost an hour, Wyatt pacing the length of the porch with the phone pressed to his ear while Callie mouthed, "Well," from the doorway. Bakker was interested in regenerative rice grown on rebuilt, husk-amended soil, a story European buyers were starting to pay a premium for. He offered a 3-year contract at nearly 50% above local mill price, starting with one 20-foot container, roughly 19 metric tons. When Wyatt hung up, he sat down on the porch steps and didn't say anything for a while. For the first time since his father died, Wyatt let himself believe the farm might actually make it. The next 18 months brought 3 separate blows. First, the bank's loan officer, a soft-spoken woman named Patricia Nunn, called Wyatt in for a meeting he wasn't expecting. "Your note's been purchased," she told him, sliding a letter across the desk. 90 days, then it's due in full. The buyer was a holding company Wyatt had never heard of, registered out of Little Rock. It took Callie one afternoon on the county clerk's website to trace the paperwork straight back to Vernon Voss. Wyatt spent 3 sleepless nights on the phone before the Regional Farm Credit Co-op agreed to a bridge loan, just enough to cover the gap. Second, for days before the first shipment was due to leave port, Yost Backer's local agent called Wyatt directly, her voice careful and apologetic. "We received an anonymous report," she said, "claiming your rice failed a contamination screening. I have to ask you to hold the shipment until we can verify." It hadn't failed anything. An independent lab in Little Rock retested the batch within the week and cleared it completely, but the 4 days of silence from Rotterdam were some of the longest of Wyatt's life. Third, and hardest to swallow, Otis came by one evening with an old county mill ledger he'd borrowed from a friend at the Historical Society. It confirmed what his grandfather's notebook had only hinted at: the original husk dumping on coal land, decades earlier, hadn't been a favor at all. Otto Voss had arranged it deliberately, dumping raw husks, before anyone understood biochar, onto that low corner of the farm year after year, knowing untreated husks would acidify and choke the soil over time. It was a quiet, patient way of keeping the coals too strapped to ever compete with the mill. Vernon had simply inherited the arrangement and kept it running, never once imagining that the same pile of waste would one day become the thing that saved the farm his father had spent 30 years trying to bury. By that second summer, Otis had started watching the sky more than the fields. "Creek's down 2 feet at the bridge," he told Wyatt one evening. "Almanac's calling for the driest August since '83. Katydids have gone quiet at night. I don't like that." The drought that followed was the worst Hartwell Bend had seen in 41 years. The county reservoir dropped visibly by the week, its concrete boat ramp stranded 30 feet from the waterline. The creek at the county bridge, usually knee-deep in August, was down to a trickle you could step across without wetting your boots. Neighboring farmer Hollis Pruitt, whose soil hadn't been treated, watched nearly 40% of his 150 acres wither before harvest, the leaves curling and browning at the edges like paper too close to a flame. The coal field struggled too, but held. The biochar-amended soil, dense with that honeycomb carbon structure Otis had described, kept moisture in the root zone long after Pruitt's ground had cracked and gone pale. Walking the rows, Wyatt could see the difference himself: soil that still gave a little under his boot, instead of soil that had turned to hardpan. It wasn't a miracle. It was chemistry, and it was enough. The shipment was due to load the same week the reservoir hit its lowest recorded level. That same week, Voss's holding company called the bridge loan due in full, timed to land exactly when Wyatt needed every dollar for freight and export paperwork. At the County Grange Hall, during an emergency water-sharing meeting, folding chairs packed shoulder to shoulder and the box fans doing nothing against the heat, Voss stood up first and tried to make his case for pulling the loan regardless of the drought, arguing the co-op should reclaim water rights for farms with a future. That was when Ray Dawkins stood up, hands shaking, and asked to speak. He admitted what he'd been carrying for months. He was the one who'd told Voss about the husk pile that first week, and later about the shipment schedule. Voss had been quietly covering his mother Linda's cancer treatments in exchange for information, a little at a time, never framing it as anything more than keeping him posted. "I didn't want to hurt you," Ray said, voice cracking, not looking at anyone but the floor. "Mama's bills were more than I could carry. I told myself it wasn't really hurting anybody. I didn't know what else to do." The room went silent. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment. Then he crossed the room and put a hand on Ray's shoulder. "You should have told me," he said, quiet enough that only the front rows heard it. "Not because of the debt. Because I'd have helped." Neighbors who'd watched the test plot 2 summers earlier didn't wait to be asked. Uncle Dale showed up at 5 the next morning with his own truck and trailer to help load. Half the men from the meeting followed him. The container left for port on schedule. By the following spring, Big River Milling had quietly changed hands. Voss no longer had any part in running it, and nobody in Hartwell Bend saw much reason to ask where he'd gone. Ray was still working the coal farm, paying Wyatt back a little each month, though Wyatt had told him more than once he didn't have to. Linda Dawkins's treatment was going well, and some mornings she sent biscuits out to the farm with Ray, just because. Uncle Dale started building a second kiln behind his own barn that April, without being asked, and without much comment beyond, "Figured I'd need one eventually." Callie finally cut back her shifts at the diner to help run the little roadside shop full-time, hand-lettering a new sign herself, "Cole Family Rice, grown on ground we brought back." One evening, alone in the barn where he'd first found it, Wyatt finally finished reading his father's letter. It hadn't been a goodbye. It had been an answer to the argument Wyatt never got to have. His father writing, plainly, that he was proud Wyatt wanted to study things the old farm never had the chance to learn, and that he hoped Wyatt would bring some of that learning home one day, not to keep the place the same, but to make it better than either of them had known how. Wyatt folded the letter and set it back where he'd found it, in the sack, in the barn, in the ground his father had spent his whole life trying to understand. "He always said the ground remembers everything," Wyatt told Callie later that night, "if you're patient enough to let it show you."